Thank you all so much. And to Jamie, as ever, as you know, this is the world's longest unfolding Episcopalian bar mitzvah for Jamie. We all do. The Torah reading this morning will be from Abraham Lincoln. No. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about three topics. It's going to sound a little like a joke, and there's a rabbi and one parachute. It's about President Trump, Andrew Jackson, and George Herbert Walker Bush, right? It sounds like a joke is about to begin, but this is a true story. In March of 2017, I'm a Jackson biographer. In March of 2017, President Trump announces that he's coming down to Nashville, where I live, to embrace Andrew Jackson. And so I'm sitting at home, and I think I should do something about this. So I write an open letter to the president. Dear Mr. President, welcome, delighted you're embracing history, but if you're going to embrace Andrew Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts. And there are plenty of crazy parts of Andrew Jackson to embrace, right? He once said that his only two regrets in public life were that he had not shot the Speaker of the House and hung his own vice president. So, past his prologue. But Jackson was a unionist. He believed in the rule of law, ultimately. He never said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. That was invented. And so I sent this letter off to the local newspaper. And in a kind of a brave editorial move, the entire front page of the Nashville Tennessean on the day the president arrived was my letter. And they said it actually in his imageable profile. It had no effect, whatever, on President Trump. But the next day, true story, I'm walking into lunch and my phone rings, and it was George Herbert Walker Bush. And President Bush had been sick that winter, so he was down in Houston in the hospital. His staff was printing out stuff for him to read. They printed out this letter. He called, he said, how you doing? And I said, Dana Carvey once said the key to doing the old man's voice was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. It's a bird. Not gonna do it. It took me 17 years to write a biography of him. It was supposed to be posthumous, but the son of a bitch wouldn't die. I'd bring it up, he'd say, not gonna do it. And so he called, and he said, I read your letter to Jackson. And I thought, oh my God, the old man's losing it, right? He thinks I'm writing letters to dead people. And so I said, Mr. President, thank you, true story. But you know, that was a letter to Trump about Jackson. And without missing a beat, the old man said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention. And then he hung up. He had thought of the joke. He wanted to deliver it. He said, see ya. That was it. Boom. So that's a lot of American history in one phone call. All right? Our 7th president, our 41st president, our 45th and 47th. And the story of American history, self-evidently, is not one of inevitable progress. But it is also not one of irreversible decline. Why? Because it is a human undertaking. A democracy is the fullest manifestation of all of us. Our individual characteristics of heart and mind matter enormously. There are institutional structures, there are incentive structures that lead us to unhappy outcomes. Why? Because since the 3rd chapter of Genesis, we have often made the wrong decision. Right? There was a piece of fruit, we were told not to take it, we wanted it, we took it, and here we are. Right? Seriously. I mean, if you think about it, the entire story of human nature is one where we often take when we should give. I would submit to you that the remarkable thing about human history is that we've given as much as we have. Not to congratulate ourselves, not to rest on those laurels, but it is an orienting thought, it seems to me. It's a proportionate thought. As you, and if you're here, let's be honest, you watch too much cable news, right? This is actually an intervention. Your children have asked us to say, please stop. There's a husband and a wife. I mean, I've had women walk up to me, which doesn't happen enough, or ever, actually, and say, oh, I turn on the TV at 6 a.m. and I don't turn it off till midnight. I'm like, well, that's really terrible. But we live in an era in which the forces that have shaped American life, for good and for ill, are moving at a rapid and potentially dispositive rate. We do ourselves no favors. I'm not here to stand here and say, this too shall pass. It may not. It may not. Most things pass. But it could pass to something worse. Not impossible. So we have to stand, it seems to me, with John Belushi, that great American political thinker, who said, get you to see President Trump, John Belushi's doing great work. When John Belushi said in Animal House, did we give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? We didn't. And so we have to find a way to metaphorically arm ourselves. What does that look like? I want to talk to you about how Abraham Lincoln did it. And that can seem monumental. That can seem like, oh my God, you're going to tell me how Lincoln did it. I just want to get through the day on CNN. No. Abraham Lincoln was a fallen, frail, and fallible man. He was not for citizenship for black Americans. He was not an abolitionist. Let me say that again. Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was a gradual emancipationist in an era where it was still very much a live question about what kind of human being one was, as if there were different kinds. This is our greatest president. This is the one that for a second you thought, oh, I thought this was going to be about today and it's about Lincoln and he's a god. No, he's not. If you stand at the Lincoln Memorial, which I highly recommend you go to as often as you can, the remarkable thing about the Lincoln Memorial is not its grandeur, but the human anguish on the face of the statue. It is a Greek temple. It is a classical temple. But when you step inside, what do you see? You see a man mourning the loss of a son, enduring a fairly difficult domestic life, presiding over a nation where 750,000 people would be killed. Parenthetically, for those of you all who think that, oh, if only things could be like they used to be, we didn't wake up in the middle of the 19th century, people who look like me, and say, you know what, let's end slavery. How did we end slavery? We killed 750,000 people. And we're going to talk in a second about what a close-run thing that was. Again, I say this not to either be falsely reassuring or overly negative, but if we don't look history in the eye and then look ourselves in the eye, as opposed to looking up at it adoringly, oh, it was a mythic past, or down on it condescendingly, oh, they were all wrong, they were evil. We have to look it in the eye so that when we look ourselves in the eye, we can see us for what we are. And if we don't know what we have been, we surely can't know what we want to be. That's why a conversation with the American past is not elective. It's not just for the Jamie Fest. It's essential to American democracy. If we do not know from whence we came, how are we going to know where we want to go? And this is not a coffee mug thing. This is not a needlepoint pillow talk. You know what I'm talking about. But as Henry Kissinger used to say, it has the virtue of being true. We have to know what the American journey was like. We can't know what the American journey was like if we don't know what the human journey has been, in order to equip ourselves in critical moments to make a decision between being open-handed or clenching a fist, between hoping or fearing, between building a wall or building a bridge. And we're not always going to build the bridge. But at critical moments in the American past, we have managed to do that. Often, as Winston Churchill said, after we had exhausted every other possibility. Let me tell you my favorite Churchill story, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's the only thing you'll remember from this. So Churchill was in the men's room of the House of Commons one day, and he was standing at the trough. And Clement Attlee, the socialist Labourite prime minister, comes in and stands next to him, and Churchill goes like this. And Attlee looks at him and says, "Winston, are you feeling standoffish today?" And Churchill said, "No, it's just that every time you see something big, you want to nationalize it." So anyway, no significance. Really not significant, but a good story. It's an old rule of preaching. Give them one thing to remember. We did it with slavery. We did it with the Second World War. We did it ultimately with civil rights. And now we're going to have to decide whether we're going to do it with the rule of law and the maintenance of a democratic lowercase d covenant in which we accept temporary defeat in order to preserve an arena in which, playing by the same rules, we can ultimately achieve a victory. That's democracy. That's it. You can't change the rules when you're losing. That's the rule of law. That, to me, is the difference of kind as opposed to degree. If we had been here, we probably did have this conversation 10 years ago, I would have said, and probably did, that President Trump, whom I insist on calling President Trump as a sign of respect, because the other side very rarely referred to President Biden that way. There was this creature named Biden on Fox, Biden. President Trump represented the manifestation of perennial forces in American life. But it was a difference of degree, not of kind, until the aftermath of the 2020 election. And the attempt to overturn that election was a difference of kind. That had not happened before. Andrew Jackson, again, in 1825, wins a majority of the popular vote, wins a plurality of the electoral vote. It goes to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams strike a bargain, which Jackson hashtags corrupt bargain, and gives the presidency to John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson, temperamental, tough, frontier energy, accepts the result because it was a constitutional remedy. And so he went back to Nashville and he started running again. He didn't have a rally on the Ellipse. He didn't send people to the Capitol. He didn't then pardon the people who assaulted police officers. Just didn't happen. That is the closest thing we've got to an analogy, and the craziest guy we ever had as president until recently followed the rule of law. And so the rule of law matters because you and I are only able to live together if we recognize each other's dignity and standing within the order of our community. It doesn't work otherwise. It just, and the fact, thank you, the fact that you have to clap at that is a really bad sign. Right? That should be like, hey, there's oxygen in the room. But we are in a moment, and I know there's some of you, I can tell from your looks, that are like, well, yeah, but I kind of like his tax policy. Okay, fine. I don't like woke. Okay, fine. But ponder well, there is no truer axiom in human affairs than the rule of the strong is very satisfying when you're strong. And there is no more truer axiom than the people who are strong in this season tend to become weak in the next. That's what revolutions are. So if you throw in your lot with strength as opposed to principle, if you throw in your lot with nationalism, which is an allegiance to your own kind, as opposed to patriotism, which is an allegiance to a creed, you better hope that your strength and your kind maintain absolute control, because it's not going to be pretty when it reverses. That's why we have a constitution. It's why we have civil society. It's why the American experiment, which grew out of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 89, matters so much. Is that if you and I are sovereign before the law and before God, then our rights come from above and they can't be messed with. If the rights come from around us, they can be taken away. It's the difference between liberty and tolerance. James Madison was 25 years old, brilliant insight. He was writing he was part of the Constitutional Convention in Virginia. They were always writing constitutions. And he wrote a bill for religious toleration. And George Mason, another Virginian, came to him and said, don't call it toleration, call it liberty. Because toleration implies that there is someone allowing you to do something. It is a horizontal arrangement. If it is liberty, it comes from above, and it can't be taken away. That's a fundamental Western insight. It comes from the Glorious Revolution and the battle between Parliament and King, but it was fully manifested here. Only for folks who looked like me. I'm a boringly heterosexual, white, Southern male Episcopalian. You know, things work out for me in this country most of the time. We had a hell of a run. We had about 12,000 years in charge. We had some moments, you know. Although now we seem to be back. But here's the thing. We're back, but if you're back and you're out and the point of the American experiment was that we would stand of equal dignity and settle our problems for a given period of time in the public arena, and that solution would go for a while, and then we'd revisit it and we'd change it. That would be the unfolding story of the country. If you take away the rule of law and the Constitution, and it becomes that the folks who look like me or are part of one party or another have absolute power as opposed to contingent power, then absolute power means that there are some people who are better than others. And there are always the differences in talent and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about intrinsic worth. The majesty of America has been that we were able to find, and the purpose of politics, I believe, is to find certain solutions to given problems for a certain period of time and then we revisit it again. What is the common denominator here? The common denominator, to the points I've made, is that there is a right and there is a wrong. There is a moral component to human life. Who decides who's right and who's wrong is a matter of conscience. And we all know, I think, ultimately, whether something is right or wrong. That doesn't mean we're going to do the thing that's right. I know I don't. I spend most of my time doing the wrong thing. Robert Louis Stevenson once said, "The duty of the Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully." Only by that standard am I a good Christian. But let's talk about Lincoln and conscience. Because my friend Doris Goodwin, who some of you know this, but I mean, for those of you who don't, about a year ago, someone tweeted out that if Doris Goodwin and Mr. Rogers had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And so I thought it was great. Doris was kind of irritated. So she called and she said, "Couldn't Mr. Rogers and I have fallen in love and you were the fruit of our union?" And I said, "No, sweetheart, he picked you up in the C-SPAN bar." So tell her that. It really upsets her. You'll see her later, I'm sure. But Doris wrote a marvelous book, which I'm sure most of you know, called Team of Rivals, about Abraham Lincoln and his political genius. Absolutely right, an American classic. I have a slightly different view than Mom. Children are always rebelling. And that is that if Lincoln was not a wholly political creature, at several critical moments, he did something that was politically difficult and possibly fatal because it was the right thing to do. There was a conscience at the heart of his politics. And just run through them quickly. There are three critical moments. If he'd only been a politician, he would have done a different thing, and we'd be living in a different world. So, in 1860, he runs for president, stands for president. He didn't run in those days. And his central claim in that campaign is that, American slavery is secure where it exists. People forget this. The Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist party. It was going to leave slavery, which was a state institution. The Constitution did not actually recognize slavery. It acknowledged it, it accommodated to it, but James Madison carefully, for the lawyers in the room, carefully made sure that the Constitution did not recognize the principle of what was called property in man, so that it would not be an absolute right. It would be a contingent state institution. And when people, again, parenthetically, when people talked about abolition in the 19th century, they weren't really talking about federal action, because it wasn't a federal institution. They were pressuring the states to emancipate. It's a subtlety, but it's important, because it explains Lincoln in the winter of 1860-61, with South Carolina seceding, which they always do. Hard to keep them in. There was a compromise on the table from a senator from Kentucky named John James Crittenden. Does anybody here know the Crittenden Compromise? This is very important, because it would have changed everything about where we are. And slavery, if this had passed, probably would have taken root in California. So bear with me for a second. 1860-61. Every wise guy like me who would be sitting on the MSNBC of the era, writing opinions and talking to politicians, we were all saying, the chattering classes of the era were all saying, Lincoln should take, the states are seceding, Senator Crittenden has offered a brilliant compromise that will avoid civil war. So what was the Crittenden Compromise? It was that we were simply going to do away with the Missouri, we were going to restore the Missouri Compromise line so that slavery couldn't take root north of the 3630. But Arizona, New Mexico, possibly California, could impose slavery if they wished. California, remember, had come in 1850 as a free state. It would have relieved the pressure for the South. They would have been reassured that they were not being locked into their narrow world. Slavery would be able to go out. And a lot of Northern liberals were for this because they didn't think that slavery would be particularly useful out here. You know, you can't, I mean, y'all grow golf courses, right? I mean, I don't know what else you do. I'm all for it, by the way. Everybody wanted to do this. Wall Street was behind it. 20,000 merchants in New York. Think about how many merchants that was given the relative population of New York. Wrote a petition saying, take the Crittenden Compromise. Charles Francis Adams of the Adams dynasty was for it. Lincoln said no. Why did he say no? Everybody wanted to do it. William Seward, the most powerful Republican in the country except for Lincoln, who thought he should be president, like most secretaries of state, that's part of the job. I could do that job. Wanted to do it. Lincoln said no. Why did he say no? Because he had won a presidential election with 39% of the vote, but had won a presidential election on the claim that slavery could not be extended. Not that it had to be abolished, but that it couldn't be extended. A little less heroic, right? This goes back to when you were worried that this was going to be a story about some great, unapproachable man. He was willing to leave it alone, as long as it stayed where it was. In my part of the world, I'm from Tennessee, folks like me had big plans for slavery. And that Crittenden Compromise not only would have taken slavery out here, but it would have smashed forever the Lincoln articulated principle that the federal government had control over one thing in terms of slavery, and that was its expansion. That was the one, it was in the Constitution, that Congress organized the territories. And once it's like Churchill and Hitler, once you compromised that principle, that was slavery's Munich, if that had happened. Because the designs in the South were to go, we all think right now that slavery was just something in the SEC, right? It was just, you all think it's a stock thing, I know, the Southeastern Conference. That wasn't the plan. The plan was for what was called the Golden Circle. There were maps, there were books about this, prospectus. The Golden Circle was going to be a slave-based empire with Richmond at the top, going all the way down through the Caribbean and the Gulf of America, and with Havana at the center. Five presidential administrations had tried to take over Cuba heading into 1860 because of its potential as the center of a slave-based agricultural empire. The group that was supporting this plan was called the Knights of the Golden Circle. John Wilkes Booth was a Knight of the Golden Circle. So we know where the United States ends. We know where the border is. They didn't know. In the 19th century, they kept moving the thing around. It wasn't until the Mexican War that Texas, California, the country was always shifting. And the notion was that slavery would become the heart of this part of the United States. And if they had to secede, it would just become Richmond or Montgomery would be the political capital, Havana would be the economic capital. That was the plan. Lincoln understood that. And he knew that if he gave up the principle and let it go west, he couldn't stop it from going south. And so he said no, creating a cascading effect of seceding states. Why? Because if you give up that principle, it was done. And I would submit that had Lincoln taken the Crittenden Compromise, slavery would have lasted in the United States well into the 20th century. Because the only allusion I could ever find in Abraham Lincoln's writing to the 20th century was in a gradual emancipation program he proposed, where they were going to compensate and time it out, compensate not the slaves but the slave owners, to ultimately to a year where there would actually be emancipation in 1900 AD. That's in his State of the Union in 1862. The State of the Union that we all know because of the last paragraph that Sam Waterston reads so beautifully, right? We cannot escape history. We in this Congress, in this administration, we remembered in spite of ourselves down to the latest generation. And we shall either now nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of man on earth. Aaron Copland. 3 paragraphs up, he proposes slavery lasting until 1900. We can learn from that. I don't know about you all, I learn a lot more from sinners than I do from saints, which is a good thing given the relative population of the two. It was a terrible idea to let slavery go until 1900. But he was trying. He was struggling. He was going through what George Eliot called dim lights and tangled circumstance. He stood, he allowed the war, he enabled the war to come because it was wrong to give in and perhaps have slavery take even deeper root. Cut to 1864. It's the summer of 1864. To tell you how Lincoln is running for re-election. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that a country, for those of you who are worried about our institutions, and I'm one of them, imagine any other country in the world holding a presidential election in the middle of an armed rebellion that was killing hundreds of thousands of people. It never occurred to Lincoln to postpone the 1864 election. In a struggle to save the Constitution, he thought you could not break the Constitution in that way. And heading into, before Atlanta falls, which was in early September, it looks as if he's going to lose to George McClellan, the general he had fired. McClellan was explicitly going, if he had won the 1864 presidential election, was going to revoke the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order. We've heard a lot about those lately. It did not have legislative force. It was a military order. So a new president could yank it back. And he was ahead. And to tell you how long ago this was, the chairman of the Republican National Committee was the editor of the New York Times. This is a long time ago. And he comes down, and he has a meeting with Lincoln on the 21st of August, 1864. He says, I think you're going to lose, and so you need to say that emancipation will be an article of negotiation in order to end the Civil War. It has to be on the table. And if you do that, I think you win. And Lincoln said no. It was the politically astute thing to do. You could have fixed it later. He said no. Why? Because in his sense of right and wrong, he said, I cannot have asked black men to put on the gold eagle of the Union Army and fight for their liberty and this Constitution and then re-enslave them. And if I have to lose, I lose. And this isn't just some sort of sweet story. He wrote it down. He said that this administration, it looks as if we will lose, and if we lose, we will cooperate with the incoming administration in a transition. It was called the blind memorandum. He had the whole cabinet sign it and put it in the desk drawer, waiting in case he lost. Why? Because it was the right thing to do. I tell you all of that for two reasons. One is to show you the complexity of what often comes down to us as a simple story. And the other is to shine as best we can a light on what we mean when we say the better angels of our nature. The phrase was Lincoln's. He borrowed it from Othello. Dickens had used it. The better angels of our nature only have to show up in extremis, but they do have to show up. And they did for Abraham Lincoln. And they barely did, moving us forward in history a little bit. When did we declare war on Nazi Germany? Anybody? We didn't. They did. They declared war on us. Pearl Harbor's December 7th. December 8th, FDR goes to the Congress, gives that great speech. The American people in their righteous might shall win through to absolute victory. I made my 7-year-old memorize that. We're not close anymore. Just kidding. Sort of. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't mention Germany on the 8th, 9th, 10th, or 11th of December in 1941, because he doesn't know if he's going to have the congressional support to fight Nazi Germany. I'm going to say that again. Franklin Roosevelt did not know that he was going to have the support in Congress to fight Nazi Germany until the 12th of December, 1941, when Hitler, in one of the mistakes from which he would never recover, declares war on us. And then we declared war on them. It took us until 5 days after Pearl Harbor to declare war on the embodiment of evil in the modern world. So, I can sort of handle Elon Musk in that context, right? And again, it's not that I'm not being dismissive about it, but one of the reasons I believe, not to panic, not to mindlessly panic, you can mindfully panic all you want, but not to mindlessly panic, is because we've barely gotten there before. And the critical delineating, dispositive delta, the factor in all of this, is what's worth fighting for. For Lincoln, ultimately, it was the Declaration of Independence. The most important sentence ever originally rendered in English, what Lincoln called the apple of gold in the picture of silver. That it was the idea, Lincoln said about Jefferson, all honor to Jefferson, to the man who in the cataclysm of a struggle for national independence had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to enshrine in a revolutionary document an eternal truth that for all time would be a stumbling block to reappearing tyranny and oppression. Son of a bitch could write. Coolness, forecast, and capacity. We're not very cool. We're not very good at forecasting, but we do, history tells us, have the capacity to do the right thing. And often it requires us to do so at the cost of our immediate interest. Democracy, fundamentally, is about deferring our own gratitude in order and in the hope that we will ultimately be gratified by a system that protects us in good times and also enables us to endure bad times. That's what democracy is. and it's a moral thing. It's Lincoln in the winter of 60-61 saying no. It's Lincoln in the summer of 1864 saying no. And it's Franklin Roosevelt saying at last in 1941. These are flawed, frail, and fallible people. Y'all are better people than I am. That's not hard, so don't get cocky. But I know that if I do the right thing 51% of the time, that's a hell of a good day. So why would the country be any different? I started with George H.W. Bush. I want to end with him. Democracy, again, a moral undertaking. And this is a letter that President Bush Sr. wrote to his mother in the late 1950s. The Bushes lost a daughter to leukemia. Robin was her name, in 1953. George W. had been born in 46. Robin was born in 49. Jeb Bush was born in 53. When they brought Jeb home from the hospital in Midland, Texas, Robin was bruising. She was tiring easily. The first time the Bushes ever heard the word leukemia was in the pediatrician's office in Midland, Texas. She was 4 years old. She died over the Columbus Day weekend in 1953. About 5 years later, George H.W. Bush wrote the following letter to his mother, Dorothy Walker Bush. It was found in her papers in her bedside table in Greenwich when she died in 1992. This is George H.W. Bush about the loss of Robin. There is about our house a need. The running, pulsating restlessness of the boys as they struggle to learn and grow needs a counterpoint. We need some starch crisp frocks to go with all our torn-kneed blue jeans and helmets. We need some soft blonde hair to offset those crew cuts. We need a dollhouse to stand firm against our forts and rackets and 1,000 baseball cards. We need someone who's afraid of frogs. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once. She'd fight and cry and play and make her way just like the rest. But there was about her a certain softness. She was patient. Her hugs were just a little less wiggly. She'd climb into sleep with me, but somehow she'd fit. She didn't wake me up with pug nose and mischievous eyes, a challenging quarter-inch from my sleeping face. No, she'd stand beside our bed until I felt her there. Silently and comfortable, she'd put those precious, fragrant locks against my chest and fall asleep. Her peace made me feel strong, and so very important. My daddy had a caress, a certain ownership, which touched a slightly different spot than the "Hi, Dad" I love so much. But she is still with us. We need her, and yet we have her. We can't touch her, and yet we can feel her. We hope she'll stay in our house for a long, long time. So in the course of writing about the president, I asked him to read that letter out loud to me. And we were in his office in Houston. And long before he finished, he broke down with an extraordinary level of physical sobbing. I'd never actually seen anyone cry quite like that. And in the midst of it, his chief of staff, a wonderful woman, came in and saw what we were doing and said to me, "Why did you want President Bush to read that?" And I said, "Well, if you want to know someone's heart," and before I could finish, the president jumped in and said, "You have to know what breaks it." That's a better angel. Thank you all.